Hi, everyone. How are we all doing today? Good? Fantastic. Good lunch? Yeah, well nourished. Fantastic. All right, so my name is Mike Geig. I'm an evangelist at Unity Technologies, and today we're going to be talking about how we can use addressable assets to improve our workflows and improve our games and our asset plans and all that fun stuff. So quick show of hands, who here uses asset bundles or has used asset bundles? All right, show of hands, who here enjoyed using asset bundles? Yeah? You liars. So we're going to talk about how we can use this thing called addressable assets to sort of streamline and improve that system. Has anyone tried addressable assets? The people who currently work at Unity aren't allowed to raise their hand. All right. So let's take a look at how these things work. So why addressable assets, right? So we have this thing called asset bundles. We have the resources folder. You can always call resource.load. Why have this thing called addressables? Well, when we're working with large games, right, games that are more sophisticated, asset bundles become very difficult to maintain. All right, it's up to you to create them, it's up to you to manage them, it's up to you to plan them, and you have better things to worry about than how you're mapping your asset bundles and dependencies and resource management and stuff like that. Also, resources.load, not a really good way of managing your assets, right? It works, right? A lot of things just work. We could also save player data to our, player preferences file, but that's not a good idea necessarily. So resources.load can work, but there are a lot of shortcomings with asset bundles as they exist now and with resources. And so the addressables aims to really simplify how we build these assets, and we want to separate how we build them versus how we talk to them, right? I don't want to care where my assets are. I just want to say, give me this asset I need, and I want to receive this asset. And I don't want to have to know how I'm going to use my assets necessarily when I'm planning my system or how they're going to be packed. And so we want to simplify that process. Also, dependency resolution. You have things that are shared across different bundles, and when do you load one versus the other and all that stuff. How do we manage our memory? When is it okay to unload something versus when is it not? Again, we want to manage that stuff for you. And then finally, just iterating in development, right? Using asset bundles, there's no way to simulate whether or not you're actually using asset bundles. So you have to write all of your own code to simulate that. And it's a pain, right? And every time you want to iterate, you have to rebuild your bundles and then push them to some server or something like that. It takes time. It's slow and it's annoying. And we want to simplify that with this new addressable system. All right, so I don't like PowerPoint, so let's just get right into the editor. And we're going to see how this works. So I have a project here, looks great, there we go, just a plane there. And if I hit play right now, what we have a character that spawns in, is loaded in by my game manager, and then like every 3 seconds it spawns a spider bot. And if I get too close to the spider bots, they start chasing me, and I'm just trying to stay alive. All right, so that's this game. And I have a game manager here that says, okay, so what's my player's prefab, and what kind of enemies do I have, and then it manages loading those for me. All right, so everything is here in the editor, just sort of ready to go, all using just your regular game objects and just assets on the hard drive. Now, I understand that most of us already have projects we're working on, right? And so we really want to address this from how do you use addressable assets if you already have a project? You don't want to flip a switch and delete all of the way you're handling assets now and try to use this new system all at once. It's too risky. So instead, let's look at how we slowly implement these assets slowly throughout our game without doing everything all at once, which is maybe a good way to go about it. So I'm going to start with the player. So right now, my game manager is like my bootstrapper. When the scene starts up, it says, oh, there's no player, let's create a player. So I'm going to turn the player from being just a prefab on my hard drive into an addressable asset. And so I'm going to go to the code of my game manager. And right here, I have some code, and I want to zoom Visual Studio. There we go. I have this public game object player prefab, and that's what I'm going to use to instantiate. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you know what, let's not use a game object, let's use an asset reference. Now what does that mean? Well, now it's just a reference to an asset. Well, what is the asset? I don't care. Doesn't matter. It's an asset, and I'm going to reference it. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? I don't need to know. I do not care. All right, so I'm just going to have some prefab that is a reference to some asset. And now down here in my start, I have instantiate, which is my game object instantiated of that player prefab, and I'm going to say, let's not do that. Instead, since this is some addressable asset, I'm going to say, hey, addressable asset, make a copy of yourself that's a game object. And I've just instantiated a player. It's kind of the same line of code. Instead of game object.instantiate, it's addressable asset.instantiate as a game object. It's worth noting that this here is an asynchronous operation. All addressable assets are asynchronous operations. That way we have no blocking operations on our main thread with anything we do. So if I needed an access to this player's reference right here and now, I would have to wait for it to be loaded and then grab the reference to it. I couldn't do it right here and now, but that asynchronicity helps us a lot with managing load times and things like that. So that's all I'm going to do. I just switched the game object to an asset reference. I'm going to come back to Unity. It's going to recompile. My game manager is going to change for a player prefab to something like this. None. Show me an addressable asset. Well, I don't have any addressable assets. Well, this says, well, I can use the addressable assets window to initialize some addressable assets. So I'm just going to drag my addressable assets window. So I'm going to go up to window and then asset management and addressable assets. And I have this window. And it says, all right, well, I could create some addressable asset settings, but that sounds like a lot of work, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go to my prefabs where my player is, and I'm just going to drag my player onto the game manager where it says, what's my addressable asset? I'll just drop it there. And it's going to say, okay, well, let's just create some addressable asset settings for you. Now, right now, since this is a preview, I need to force this window to refresh. So there we go. Now it's refreshed and it says, oh, there's some settings. And let's take a look at what actually happened. So I dragged my player onto a script that had an asset reference. The system said, well, you're not using addressable assets. We don't have any settings. So let's create those for you. And then let's assign this player prefab as an addressable asset. This is a lot like with asset bundles, saying this game object is in this asset bundle, and then the system knows about it. There's a key difference, though. What I'm going to notice is this new folder appeared called my addressable asset data. And inside here, I have my asset groups and data builders and all these sort of scriptable object things and whatnot. A key thing is all addressable asset information is in that one folder. Unlike asset bundles, which changed the meta files of every asset I touched, which caused my source control to say all of these files have changed when nothing about the files have changed at all, now all of that data is there inside that addressable assets folder, which means if I ever want to stop using addressable assets, I just delete that folder. Done. Because there have been no changes to any of my assets, their meta files, anything like that. No other change in my project, and thus there's nothing to sync besides this one folder on my source control to manage those changes, which is awesome, right? Anytime you ever did any sort of A/B testing on asset bundles, your source control said, hey, you've changed every asset in your entire project. You thought, no, I haven't. What are you talking about? And so now it's all self-contained in this folder here. And so now we can see here that I have this built-in data and this default local group. By the way, I'll show you here at the end how I added addressables, how I got that window there, right? And I'll show you where you can learn more and stuff. So if you're curious, I will explain it, trust me. And so here, for starters, we have this default local group. And if I expand that, here I have my player prefab. And this is the path to it, and then this is the path to it, this is the name of it. I could rename it if I wanted it to have some different name. The reason the name is the same as the path to start with is in case I start converting some of my resources. Resources are all based on the long string name, and so it wants to maintain that same path. But I could rename that, it's just fine. I also have some labels, but I don't really care about labels right now. We'll dig into all that. For the sake of this demo, with my default local group, I am going to come over here and look at some of the things we have. So I can see we've got some schemas, and we've got some timeouts and redirects, and build path is local build, and load path is local load. I am going to say that for this demo, I'm not going to use this asset bundle cache, because we're going to make a lot of changes, and we want to see those changes. We don't want it to rely on some cached value, which might give us some results that we weren't expecting. So I'm not going to use that cache. So my default group is there by default. It's where I'm just going to put a lot of my local things that I want to be packaged with my application. It's very much like my resources.load. Anything in my default local group will be packaged in with my game executable, my APK, whatever it is I'm building. So I'm going to create a second group. This is going to be for my remote bundles. And so I'm going to right click and just say create a new group, packed assets. And I'll just rename this thing like maybe hosted assets. All right, hosted assets. And let's look at some of the settings here. So for my hosted assets, again, I want to use not use the cache. This time I'm going to say, let's use the remote build path and the remote load path. Well, what does this mean? What am I creating here? What are these groups? What are these paths? What does this mean? So this is part of that simplifying how we reference versus how we pack and store assets. Groups are going to define how our assets are packed up. And a group can be thought of like a bundle, and actually Addressable Assets uses asset bundles for you, so you don't have to maintain any of that stuff. So a group could be a bundle. So my hosted assets could be one bundle of all my hosted assets. Or I could say, you know what, don't pack these together, pack these separately, and then a group could be many bundles. And I can create many groups. And I can create all sorts of, well, maybe this is level 1 group, this is level 2 group, level 3 group, and so on and so forth. And that is just going to dictate, okay, how are these packed together, and maybe how are these served up a little bit. Like I could see, hey, this is going to be served up on a remote path and loaded from a remote load path. But here I see the actual paths. Server data / standalone windows, local host standalone windows. And if I change this back to my local build path, I'll see some local. So while the groups are defining broadly how I'm storing them, how I'm serving them, the specifics of that are actually stored in something called a profile. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to very quickly iterate across different types of development scenarios, which we're going to take a look at. So all right, so this is set up to use my remote build path, my remote load path. And these are my groups. So if I look up here for my profiles, I'm going to see I just have one profile. This is my default profile, and I'm going to add some more. So I'm going to go to Inspect Profile Settings. And the first thing I want to do is, since I'm doing some debugging, I'm going to use the debugger here soon. I do want to send my profiler event so we see that result. And down here I can see, all right, well I have my default profile, and this is where those strings are. So this is my build, my local build, my remote build, that sort of thing. But let's add some new ones. So let's add a new profile. This one might be local server. Maybe I want to test on a local networked server, right? Just while I'm in development. And then maybe I will say remote server or web server or whatever I want to call this. Remote server. And maybe this server is where, hey, where are we going to load these asset bundles from? Maybe we're loading these from my awesome server.org.biz.gov. Yes, there we go. And maybe that's, and you're going to see here how I'm going to be able to switch between these and quickly change between my deployment scenarios. I'm going to come back to my local server later when we set one up. But for default, I'm going to just, for the sake of testing and iteration, I want to say that no matter whether I've chosen assets to be stored remotely or with my executable, while I'm in default, I want everything to be packed with my executable, just because it can't fail then. It's not going to have to go out the internet or network and look for anything. It'll all be local. So I'm actually just going to grab my local build path and drop it in there, and my remote one and drop it in there. So now, whether I'm on local or remote, they're all going to use the exact same asset locations when I'm in my default profile. And let's see the results of that. So I'm in my default profile, and I will see my local build strings here. And then if I look at my remote, they're the exact same. Let's say later, I'm going to say, let's test my remote server. Well, now all of a sudden, these update to those strings. So it's just a matter of switching my profiles out. So let's continue on. All right, I'm going to stay in default. I have other ways I can test too. So if I look up here, I'm going to see my play mode script. Well, right now I'm in fast mode, where nothing's actually being built. It's pure simulation. Virtual mode will simulate building them and loading them. So that's going to let me know if there's any difficulties there. And then packed mode, while I'm in the editor, is going to do a full asset bundle build every time I hit play. Let's test loading all of these and seeing what the memory impacts and all that stuff are. It's the slowest, but it's going to give you the most accurate results here in the editor. It's like a full-on simulation. I'm just going to stick to virtual for now. Virtual works for me. All right. And so there we go. And now let's add some enemies, right? And the enemies were different than the player. The player was a single prefab that I said, hey, prefab, I'm going to create you. Now the enemies is a collection, because I could have many types of enemies. And the server is just going to randomly pick one of those enemies and spawn it. And so I don't really want to do that asset reference like I did before. I'm going to go about this a little bit differently. I'm going to write it in such a way that in the future, if I add more, it'll automatically work. And so I'm going to start by adding a label. So I'm going to go back to my profile settings here. And for labels, I have default. I'm going to create a new one called enemy. There we go. And I'm going to go to my prefabs, and I'm going to grab my spider robot, drop that on my hosted assets. And I'm going to say, okay, well, this one is an enemy. Another cool thing is, as part of this being stored in their own assets, addressable assets data folder and being completely decoupled, if later I say, oh, you know what, I wanted that here, or I wanted that there, or I want to move player here, or I want player there. I can just do that on the fly, and it's cool, all right? So because where they're stored should be irrelevant to me. But anyway, so I have this spider prefab, and I've named it enemy. So let's go back to my code. So now, here is my array of game object enemies. I'm going to comment that out. And instead, I'm going to say asset label reference. Now, asset label reference is not a variable I need. I could just use string. What is that label? And I could type in enemy. But I'm not a very good typer, and I don't pay attention to detail very well. And so I could screw that up. So instead, this is going to give me a drop-down of every label I have, and so I can't possibly screw that one up. And I'm going to have a list of resource locations that are my enemies. So not an array of game objects, a list of resource locations. What's at that location? Don't care. But I'll have a whole list of them. And so here inside start, I'm going to go ahead and just load this up. I'm going to say, okay, well, what enemies do we have? And so to do that, I'm going to say addressables.load assets, and I'll remind you that's an asynchronous operation. So load me some iResource locations with that label that's going to be the string, basically enemy. And when this is completed, call the method enemies loaded. And I've got this method right here. So again, this is an asynchronous operation, so wrong one. Asynchronous operation, so I need to say, okay, once it's loaded, what do you want to do? And once it's loaded, I'm just going to fill my list with the enemies that it loaded. So go out and find me all enemies. I don't care if they're in one asset bundle. I don't care if they're 20 in 100 different asset bundles. I don't care. Find me enemies. And it'll go find me all my enemies, and it will load them for me into this list. Again, I don't care where they are. Does not matter to me. All right, and that's going to fill this here in enemies. Now, before that was an array, so I had length. Now it's a list, so I have to do count. And instead of instantiate of some prefab, some random prefab here, I'm going to instead say addressables.instantiate as a game object, some random enemy. Still position, still quaternion.identity. So still just addressables.instantiate a game object for me, this one. Now, because I did that there, let's take a look. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to click on my game manager. There we go. And I'm going to go enemy name. That's a drop down. I'm going to choose enemy. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And so now what we have is the players loaded as an addressable asset, and so are my enemies. And if you don't believe me, that's fine. I'll prove it later. But there's one thing going on here, too, that I want to pay attention to. So while this is running, I'm going to grab my asset management, and I'm going to grab my addressables profile. And here I have my addressables profiler. And I had said before that the addressable asset system allows you to not have to worry about how you're managing your memory and your references. If you're using something, it'll be referenced and stored in memory. When you're not, it'll automatically clean that up for you. Well, how does it know? Well, let's take a look. So if I look down here, I'm going to see that I have 6 enemies loaded. Well, more specifically, I have 6 things from my hosted assets loaded. I could drill down and see that they're this spider. So I have 6 spiders. And now, as I play this and I destroy this, that number's not going down. And that's a problem, because it's not noticing that I'm getting rid of them, which means it's never going to lose references, which means it's never going to clear out that memory. Well, that's a big deal. Well, how do I fix this? So I'm going to go to my enemy health, and I'm going to look down here where I destroy the enemy when they're killed, and I'm going to say, you know what, let's not destroy the enemy. Let's do addressables.release instance. That's going to both destroy it and release the addressables instance so that when I hit 0, it can deallocate that memory for me because we're not using it anymore. I'm also going to come back to my game manager, and I'm going to say, you know what, let's not destroy my game manager if there's an extra one. Let's do addressables.release instance on that one as well. Now you're probably thinking what I was thinking when I saw that. The game manager isn't an addressable asset. That's a problem. It's actually not. Because I have addressable assets, what this is going to do is it's going to say, I'm going to release this instance. Oh, hey, guess what? It's not an addressable asset. So I'm not going to release an instance. I'm just going to destroy it. Done. Which means I can do a find all, destroy text, replace all addressables.release instance across the board, and it all just works. Actually, behind the scenes, I've been using this for everything else in my program already. So like all of my projectiles, they've actually been destroying themselves with this addressables.release instance somewhere in here. Yeah, right there, the whole time. Just works, right? So I can just, across the board, maybe I'm not ready to convert all my stuff to addressables, it doesn't matter. I can still replace that code across the board, and then when I do add it, it gets updated, and it just works. And so now when I run this, assuming I didn't do anything wrong, we should see those references decrease. So I've got 1, and now I'm down to 0, and then I got 1 again. Right, so now we're releasing those instances. So good. Moving on down the line. One thing I didn't show you, my highly advanced game, is I have a secret. Anytime I hit spacebar, I get these what I call space cubes. They're highly specialized cubes used in space that can replicate themselves like that. I know they're super de-duper impressive. And what those are actually being loaded from my resources folder. It's called My Cube. It's a very complex prefab there with a rigid body and a box collider and all that. And this is loading from the resources folder. Well, I don't really want to load from the resources folder. It's not generally a good idea to load from the resources folder if you can avoid it. And now that I can have these addressables packed with my exe, which is a lot like using the resources folder, I'm just going to do that instead. But maybe I'm not ready to move all of my resources yet. Again, if you already have a project, you don't want to go ahead and start breaking things. You want solutions. And so what I'm going to do, in my game manager here, if I scroll down, here is this check input where I'm saying resources.load async, this game object, which for my cube resource path, and when it's loaded, I instantiate it as an asset. This is standard Unity code for loading an asset from resources asynchronously. This isn't anything new. This is just, that's how you type it. Well, I'm going to undo that, or I'm going to comment that out, and instead, I'm going to try this version instead. I'm going to do addressables.load asset as a game object, this resource path, when it's completed, instantiated. Very similar. But this will allow me to work, again, on all of my resources, things from my resource folder, without necessarily needing to change them. Again, this will work even if this thing is not an addressable asset. So I can just find all, replace all across my code base for now until I'm ready to switch. As such, in case you don't believe me, I don't blame you, I'm going to go ahead and run this. And I'm going to see that I haven't changed that cube at all. Just now I'm loading it, as if it was an addressable, and it still works. Now, when I'm ready to, I can come up here and I can say, hey, where's my built-in data? There's my resources that's built in. There's my cube. I'm just going to drag this into my asset bundle, and it's going to say, hey, this is in your resources folder, and you want it to be an addressable. Can't be both, so is it cool to move it? And I'm going to say, sure. And what that's going to do is it's going to put it in a new folder right below it called resources_moved. So that's where my cube is now. And now my cube is no longer in the resources folder. It's in an asset bundle, part of my addressable assets. And I was able to just click and drag to move that. It handled all the stuff behind the scenes for me. Not to mention that if I import addressable assets into a project that uses asset bundles, it's going to say, hey, you're using asset bundles. You just want to convert them all to addressables for you? Sure. And it'll create all your groups and just do that, and then you don't have to do any of that, which is awesome. I'd like to not work. So there we go. Okay. So this is using this in the editor. That stuff's cool. Let's look at building. All right, let's build this stuff. And so right now, I'm going to go ahead and just kick off a build, and it's going to work because I believe it. And what we're going to see, so remember, I'm still in this default mode, and I am going to be loading everything from within, within this exe in the folder called streaming assets. These will get streamed in and that sort of thing. And so the first build always takes the longest, so that's fun. So we'll give this a second. We need some music. How are things in Bogota? Good? Generally good? Yeah? Yeah, it was raining a bit. All right, so we have a build. I'm going to hit play. It's made with Unity. Wow. And I'm going to see my guy, and I'm going to shoot bad guys. There they are. Die. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's say now I am ready to test this as on a hosted server. I'm ready to actually build out my remote asset bundles and stuff like that. I don't want to change any of my code. I'm not going to change any of my code because my code doesn't care where these things live. I don't want to go into my individual groups and start having to click anything in here because, again, I don't want to do any of that. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch my profile from default to local server. Now, right now that's not going to work because I don't have a local server. That's a problem. Right? I could use Python to spin one up or IIS or whatever, but web people scare me. So I'm just going to do this instead. I am going to just click this hosting button. There we go. And it's going to say, oh, let's spin up a web server inside Unity. Don't mind if I do. I know, what? And so I'm just going to add a service here. And I'm going to say enable that service. And so it's going to give me some IP address. All of these IP addresses are based off of my network interfaces. Generally speaking, only one or two of these will actually work. Unity has no way of knowing which one's like a virtual interface versus a real one, so you might have to test. I happen to know if I do an IP config on my system that this hotel is a 172 dot whatever network, and so that's how I know this one is the one that works. Your mileage will vary on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my profile settings. I'm going to edit my local server. And here where it says my remote load path, I'm just going to right click here and copy this key. And I'm going to say HTTP, and I'll drop in just this placeholder. I don't even need to know what the IP address is. I'm just going to use this variable name from that service. So it'll be whatever it is. And then I'm just going to do the same for the port. So again, just drop that in there. And there we go. Just save that. All right, so now I'm set to use my local server. I've got my hosting set up. My profile has been switched up here. It's no longer default. And so I'm just going to go ahead and build again. Not change any code. I've just changed my scenario. I'm just using a profile now that says load these from a remote location. And I'll show you here in a second to prove that I'm not lying to you. So we'll give this a second here. The second one should build faster. There we go. Before I run it, I'm going to look over here. So this is the folder my project's in. There's my builds. We can see the builds are just completed. And if I look now, the other thing I told it, the folder for my remote stuff by default is just server data, and I just left it there. And we'll see here is my standalone Windows 64, and then there is my remote asset bundles, just created just now, with my new catalog pointing out that it's there. And so there we go. So let's take a look. I'll go ahead and run this, play. And so now the player will load in from local. Doesn't have to go out to the network and find it. But these bots over here, these are loaded from bundles stored on my web server, my external server. It's still local network. It's just being run through Unity now. And there we go. So they exist. Now I could show you the one where I go to the actual remote server, but you might be shocked to discover that myawesomeserver.org.biz.gov isn't real. So instead of doing that and actually moving bundles to a web portal and stuff like that, we're gonna move on. All right, so the last thing I want to show you here inside the editor, which is super duper cool, I'll go back to local server, is let's say, all right, I've been working on my game's great, I'm just gonna close that, it's still running. My game's great, but I want to now push some new content, all right? I have a new enemy. And I don't want to rebuild this and push it out on the asset store or the app store, the Google Play or the iOS store or whatever, to force everyone to re-download my game. I want to hot load content. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to my prefabs, and I'm just going to grab this buzzer bot, drop it in my hosted assets there, and just say, hey, buzzer bot, you're now an enemy. Congratulations. And I'm not going to build this. Instead, I'm going to go up to what it says, build. But it's not a full build. And I'm just going to say build for content update. And it's going to say, okay, well, where is your last build? So they can check the catalogs of the last build and figure out what's going on there. And so here is my last build, is in builds. And, oh, you know what? I forgot a checkbox earlier. You guys, you had me confused, turned around. Let's step back a bit, because this is an important learning moment for all of us. So I forgot to check static content. And this is important. Static content is usually a good thing to do for your default local group. And it used to be on by default, and then now it's not on, and I forgot to turn it back on. What this means is this content will be our cornerstone. It will even if it's an empty thing, it will always be built in with our app. So that's where we can store our catalogs and our bin files and stuff. Because I didn't have any bundle that was the static bundle, it didn't know where to put this stuff, so it didn't. So that was my mistake. So I'm going to rebuild this, and I'm going to remove the buzzer bot before I do. Do I want to do that? Yep, that's how easy it is. Turn something into non-addressable again. So I'll just remove it there. I'm going to rebuild this just so we have that, with that static content checked, and then I'll re-edit here in a second. So I do apologize for that. This is something that is still being worked on, so sometimes the UI elements change there. But that's why we want that static content. So we'll let this build.
Mike,
Yes?
when you fill the game with the addressable objects, the executable is smaller than the...
So not the executable, but the content, the stuff that's with it. Let me show you here in just a moment. So here I'm still doing hosted, but we won't see the buzzer bot. I just did this one so it would create that cornerstone file I need. And we had a question about what this actually does. So let me verify I haven't broken everything, because that would be awesome. Nope, there's my enemies. Okay, so enemies, boom, all right. And so if I take a quick look, so normally, if you go into builds, there's always just this exe, and then there's thing that's like your game underscore data. The exe size never changes. That's just a bootloader for whatever's in your data. The data is where all this stuff is stored, and if I go in here, I see the streaming assets, addressables, standalone windows, and here is all of those bundles, both local and hosted, because I built it once before, and that's just a cached asset bundle there. So this is what grows when I keep everything local, or when I have the resources folder, or whatever. The data of my game bloats, and I don't always want that. Sometimes I want my size to be smaller, because app stores give you 50 meg limit or whatever, and we want to come in under that. All right, so now that I've done this build, and I'll know I did it right because I have this bin file, which is what it was looking for. So now I'm good now, so let's do this again. So now, let's pretend none of that happened. I'm gonna go and drag my buzzer up here and say you are an enemy, check, there we go. And now I'm going to build for content update. Go into my builds, there's the bin file I need, so that it can check that catalog and build all the new ones, and build my new bundles, the ones that have changed. And so again, I'm not rebuilding my player, I'm not rebuilding any of my existing asset bundles that are local, but for my hosted ones, my remote one will change, and I'll update that. And it's basically saying, you know what, there's just a new enemy in there. And because I wrote this to use the label, as opposed to any hard-coded, like I've clicked and dragged in the editor or whatever, it's just gonna say, find me all enemies, and it will. Now, let's go ahead and rerun this. Play. Now it spawns one enemy every 3 seconds, so sometimes with random number, oh, first one, fantastic, there's my new enemy. Sometimes I wait like 20 seconds and I start sweating, like where are my enemies? But no, this time they loaded right away, so they're there. Now I'm not getting any spiders, is what's happening. So where are my spiders? There's my spider, okay. It always makes me a little worried. So there we go. I've pushed new content without a rebuild, which means if my players was playing this game, they would just have a new enemy today, all right? And that's what my enemies do. They're bullies. There we go. I have an ECS talk where I give this guy like a gun that shoots 1,600 bullets at once, and then I just, and it's like, who's laughing now? So there we go. So hot loading content. It is important to note that all of the scripts on my enemies existed in the project to start with. I can't push new scripts via addressable assets. That's not a Unity limitation, that's a universal rule across all platforms, because it would be super dangerous if I could push new code to your devices without having Google or anyone else make sure I wasn't installing viruses or something like that. So you can't push new code to devices. They all go through a vetting process to make sure you're not doing something evil. What's that? Yeah. Prefabs, graphical content, just nothing that's an assembly, nothing that is executable code. All new textures, all new meshes, all that's fine, not code. Audio even, I believe audio, yeah, audio, all that stuff, that's all fine. All right, so that's the demo here. Let's go back to the roadmap and see what's going on. All right, so the question is always, should I use this for my game? And the answer is maybe, right? This exists now. I'll show you where you can find it, and I'll show you how I got it into the Unity editor here. But basically, if you're shipping a game right now, probably not. It's still very heavily in development, right? There's a lot of features that are cool, and it's great time savings, and it works. But little UI things like that static content became unchecked for me, and I had to remember, like, oh, I need to recheck that. Some of those things are still in flux, so probably not if you're building for this year. If you're shipping, summer or fall of 2019, absolutely. This is going to be more or less ready before then, and so it's going to be really stable by then. And if you're shipping sometime early next year, really depends on what you're doing. It depends on how complex your schema is. Like maybe you just have a few asset bundles you need, that's probably fine. But if you're doing something very obscure or complex, then maybe not. It really just depends. And feel free to reach out to us. So this year, we're working on this preview package, and we're adding stability, bug fixes, extra features that people might want. The ability to come up with your own loading schemas, data provider schemas. Maybe you need to encrypt your asset bundles, where you can provide your own encryption protocol in your loaders and stuff like that, because that's useful for a lot of people. 2019, we're going to just basically handle how building's working. We're going to make it work with ECS. We're going to make it use an ECS backend. We're going to completely sort of replace and redefine how asset bundles work, and that's where this is really going to become like sort of complete. So I'm not actually done, but this is where the links are that I wanted. So how do you add this to your project? Well, first off, there's two places. So the first off, you can go to forum.unity.com/forums/addressables.156. I don't know why .156, but that is where the forums are for this. You can ask questions. You can see the change logs, what's new, hey, this isn't working, this is whatever. If you want to actually add this to your project, all you need to do is type into your manifest file this line here, com.unity.addressables, and then I'm using version 0.4.8/preview. That's the latest one. And let me show you what I mean. So this is my project, and if I go to my packages folder and my manifest.json, right here I typed in this line, com.unity.addressables:0.4.8-preview. Then when I ran Unity, it just said, oh, cool, let me go download those things for you, and you've got it. All right, and there's an outline on how to do that on the forums and everything too. So once that happens, then you just see them in the Unity editor. That's where I get this addressables window and all that stuff. And now if I were to go to Package Manager, I can actually see the addressable system is installed with the version, and I can see, maybe a little bit about them and view license, changelog, documentation, all that stuff, all within the editor. But to add it for now, that's where you add it. We're hoping to have this just discoverable in the Package Manager by December, January. So we won't have to add that line anymore. You can just grab it from the Package Manager. It's just not in there just yet. Okay, so I have 4 minutes left, and now I'm going to end. And say thank you all very much for attending. If you have any questions, I'll be here for a few more minutes, and I'll also be outside the rest of the day. But thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great Developer Day Bogota.